All right, everyone. Welcome to Tiger Talk Tuesday. We are actually on episode 40, and this one I feel like is going to be a pretty special one, near and dear to my heart. We have guest Brady Leavold on the call. I'll give you a quick intro for those of you that are new to the series. It's called Transitioning to Life After Sports, and we're on a mission to help those suffering in silence around the globe to address players that have either left hockey due to injury, unforeseen circumstances, or retirement that forces them to hang up the jersey, and some of those transitions that they've gone to. So Brady is a retired professional hockey player who struggled immensely with mental health and substance abuse issues that stem from early childhood trauma. He eventually found himself homeless on Vancouver's notorious downtown east side. And after nearly a year on the street, Brady found himself behind bars, a place he never thought he could be. After a decade in addition, with countless overdoses, suicide attempts, struggle, and hopelessness that could have cut his story short, he finally found hope and the strength to share his truth, and has been recovering out loud, inspiring tens of thousands along the way since February of 2020, when he started sharing his journey through podcast Hockey to Hell and Back. And we're going to get into all these details. I'm going to post a much longer bio. He's the founder of the Puck Support Network, the Puck Support Corporation, and I love the play on your last name, the Believe Hockey. So let's get into it. Welcome, Brady.
Janine, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for doing this, right? I think these conversations are so important. And when I first started kind of sharing my story and navigating the waters of recovery, I found out very quickly that I was just one of many hockey players that had struggled or were struggling. And more so, I found out very lucky that I was still alive to tell my story. And so I'm just so grateful for the space, and that other people like yourself are stepping up and bringing these conversations to light.
Yeah, so let's go back. I mean, the parents or players that are tuning in. I think it's so important. Your story's so important because it can touch on both sides of the coin once we get through this. But let's go back to just your younger years of, was it always a dream to play hockey? I know it's Rhett's seen some stuff online, but was that always a vision for you?
Yeah, I think it was the only vision. From the moment I saw hockey, I fell in love with it. I think a lot of people have that same story, especially here in Canada. The speed and intensity. I always say when I saw it, it was like gladiators on ice. And I grew up in the era of, Bob Probert and Ty Domi and Darren McCarty and those guys. Pavel Bure was always my favorite. And I always tell people I wish I would have maybe look towards somebody else to try to idolize them, because I found out very quickly I was never going to be Pavel Bure. But that's okay. I just loved the game, and I think a big piece of it, I know a big piece of it was just what it brought to me from a sense of peace and serenity and belonging. And yeah, I loved it, and I spent a lot of time doing it. And when you spend a lot of time doing anything, you acquire certain skills and abilities, and that's sort of what happened. But Janine, the thing for me when I reflect back on my childhood, though I always wanted to be a professional hockey player, there was never any sense of belief around that. I was never a kid that I hear stories of guys and girls that are told they're never going to make it, and they take it and they run with it, and they're like, I'm going to show you. I was quite the opposite. And I think because of some of the circumstances that I was facing early on in childhood, it really hindered my ability to believe in myself and have that confidence. And so though I made it kind of as a professional hockey player, I reflect back, and I just think back to the belief that I had for myself, and it wasn't there, and it hindered my ability both on and off the ice for a long time. And even still to this day, I lack that belief in myself. And I think that just comes with navigating, severe mental illness and mental health challenges and being in recovery. But the short answer is that I absolutely loved hockey, wanted to be a professional hockey player, but never had any belief. And though my dad was great and supported my every move and all of that, I wonder if someone like him would have had a little bit more belief and built me up a little bit more, versus always trying to keep me in check and keep me humble, which I think is a great which was his idea, and I think he was on the right track. But I just wish that somebody like him would have came in and said, "Look, like you can do this. We can do this. Like it's going to take hard work, but you're there. Like you can do this." And that goes for anybody watching or listening to this. So often, Janine, people are told they can't do things, right? Only 0.001% make it to the NHL. Okay, but there's still a 0.001, and it has to be somebody. There's 700 and something
Yeah.
players playing right now. They came from somewhere. And I think that's something that I just wish people could rally around when somebody has that belief. And I know I'm talking a lot, but there is some dangers to that, right? When you throw yourself all into something, and you're built up your whole life, and that's the dream. And if it doesn't work out, or when it ends, because it ends for all of us in different circumstances, what does that look like? And I think that's why this conversation, your podcast, and conversations surrounding life after sport are so important.
Yeah, and I love that you even said that because one topic that comes up with a lot of the pro athletes that I interview, is they were raised, their parents, one of my buddies, Kerry Joseph, who's a coach now in the NFL with the Seattle Seahawks, he said his mom always told him, Kerry, sports are what you do, they're not who you are. And that was his grounding part of becoming an athlete. And when he said that to me, and then I'm interviewing Kurt David, who won an Emmy Award for the Glory Days, and he said it too. And I'm like, where were you guys when I played, or when my friends, because when you tell, and I tell athletes now, younger athletes, that, because it's like you said, I suffer from that identity piece as an athlete. It was like when you stop playing, you're like, what do I do now? Who am I? And we do put so much into that. So it's like having that mentorship, or those, what are your other interests? And what I wanted to go back though to what you first said, because you've touched on already a lot of points. You talked about belief. And it's interesting because if anybody watches you online, you look very confident. You're funny, you're engaging, you're honest, authentic. But I just want to reaffirm with parents or kids, anyone that has a beating heart, we might show up one way, but we still can suffer in silence, or question, or have imposter syndrome. And I just appreciate you being open and authentic to that, because your content's great. You're such a skilled hockey player. I watch you do some of your drills, and I'm like, I'm just started skating again after going through breast cancer, and I'm not at that level. You're so talented. But I just really want listeners to really realize, like, you can you can still do the thing that you love and are passionate about, and still lack the belief, even when you have all this talent. Um, so when was it for you? I know when I
I want
did
to I
some,
want to jump in real
yeah,
quick, and just I'm a little familiar with your story, and I can't imagine how hard it was for you to go through all of that. But just the fact to hear you say you just put skates back on, I mean, it's that must have felt pretty damn good, because I went almost 10 years without having a stick in my hand or skates on my feet, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but getting back on the ice was a huge piece for me to start getting my life back on track. So,
well, it's funny
um,
you say that, because I resisted it for a while, because we had, I mean, the last decade was divorce, bankruptcy, and breast cancer. Wasn't dealing with what you were dealing with for that decade, but I was a long time before I had the confidence. And people would be like, why don't you coach or do this? When I remember sitting in the bathtub that night after skating the first time, and my body was like in shock, and I cried my eyes out. And it's because the identity that who that girl used to be did not match who was on the ice that night. But it was such a, like, it was almost like an undoing, a relief of like the expectation for myself, because I played at such a high level, if that makes sense to you. But then the connection with that
100%.
childhood love, right?
Yeah, it was like I played a little bit of senior hockey and men's league since, getting my skates back on. I really just enjoy coaching and doing skill development. And I've had some pretty incredible opportunities to be able to do that with some NHL players and stuff, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But definitely went through the same thing where I think it was the first time I went on the ice with a stick, because the first time I just went skating on a lake, I didn't have any equipment, and I was on welfare, had no gear, nothing, like just had these pair of skates, and it was just about being on the ice. But the second time, when I actually went out and I had a stick in my hand and realized that I wasn't the same player that I was 10 or 12 years prior, it was almost enough to deter me from because it didn't feel good, right? Hockey
Yeah.
was always that place where I felt confident. I could step onto the ice and people in the rink would watch and be like, "Oh my God." Like, and to be honest with you, like I love that, right? And it made me feel good. And it was always the place where I knew I could just feel good and belong. And so having the feelings of not being confident on the ice, it was like, well, why am I even going to bother doing this? But luckily, and thank God that I stuck with it. And trust me, I'm nowhere near, I got bad hips. I can barely skate, but some things have come back and I've gotten over the piece of, this isn't about me. This isn't about me trying to make it to the NHL. This is about the love of the game and why I started to play in the first place. And forget about expectations, forget about, just have fun. And I think that's another thing that gets lost along the way. We forget why we start playing when we're in the thick of the stress and the pressures of trying to make a team or perform or win or whatever. Um, we're not getting ice time, all the different things, and you start questioning why you even playing in the first place. Well, we have to remember why, and that's because it's the greatest game on earth and it's so much fun. And that's kind of what I've found again over the last few years, though it's been a bit of a challenge for sure.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, well, I'm glad you're back. Let's go. So, your story, you're going off, you're playing. I mean, I did read somewhere online. I think it was you went to a music festival, and you had tried ecstasy for the first time, and that was kind of like
Yeah.
the opening to that decade of complete darkness for you.
Yeah.
What would be your, I mean, when you're talking to a younger athlete that is being exposed to things, I mean, I think about my children all the time. I can't be attached to their hip 24/7. So what advice do you give these young athletes when obviously peer pressures going around? What do you say to them?
Yeah, it's a really, really tough conversation. And I think when you're in it, when I reflect back to being a young man or teenage boy, boy, um, I don't know what the solution is other than preparing and letting these players and not just athletes, but just youth understand that, and their parents, because parents, you have to understand that your kids, unless you put them in a bubble and don't let them leave their house, there's a very, very strong chance that somewhere along the line, people are going to be like, hey, come on, try this, take this drink, try this pill, do whatever. And it's really tough to say no. For me, I was very set in my ways where I don't do drugs. I don't associate with people that do drugs. I was the athlete, records in my high school. People knew that I didn't partake in that. And I even cut a lot of people out of my life during high school because that doesn't align with my path. I want to play hockey. I want to be a hockey player. That is only going to be a distraction. I was pretty naive, right? I was very confident and cocky in the sense where I'm never going to do that. That's never going to be a part of my life. I really, truly believed that for many, many years. And when I got to that music festival, I mean, at that point, I had already started drinking, which I think is another topic for discussion because I had, my parents buy me alcohol underage, and I'm sure that's something that happens quite a bit. And generally speaking, it's pretty widely accepted and almost encouraged in our society where drinking is quote unquote normal. But at the end of the day, alcohol is a drug, and I think we're missing that. I think there's a big gap in education in helping people understand that alcohol is a drug. And so I had already started drinking, and at that time, I found that drinking made me feel better temporarily. It's another thing that doesn't get talked about. Why do people drink? Why do people do drugs? Because it feels good. My whole life, I was told drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. And yes, drugs are terrible. But when you've never experienced what they feel like and you try them for the first time, and all of a sudden you're like, holy shit, like this actually feels really good. Maybe drugs aren't that bad. And heck,
Mhm.
everyone's doing it. And peer pressure, someone's like, come on, try it, try it. And those first couple days at the music festival, I said no. I was like, because I couldn't comprehend myself ever doing them. But then also I couldn't understand that here are a couple of guys and a lot of people that I'm friends with, but a couple guys in particular that I really looked up to. They were hockey players. And it was the first time that I saw a hockey player taking drugs. And up to that point, again, being naive, I thought this is something that isn't in the hockey world. And all of a sudden now I have a guy who I looked up to tremendously, being like, come on, man, try it. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. And somewhere along the line I broke, and a big part of the story is that I was drunk, and drinking lowers your inhibitions and your decision making goes out the window. And I think there's a lot of people that'll be watching or listening to this that have probably had that experience, being like, yeah, you're right. I've made some pretty bad decisions when I was drinking, and that's what happened that night. And let me tell you, it felt like my whole life up to that point, we kind of didn't get into it, but when I was a kid, I was abused sexually at a family reunion, and I had my parents divorced at a really young age, and had a lot of confusion and just a lot of different moving parts, if you will, that really started to just hinder me as a person. And I had I was very conscious, Janine, that if people find out, at least this was my understanding, that if people find out what happened to me, then my life is going to be ruined. I'm going to be made fun of and all the different things that come along with that, because I saw that happening to kids at school or in the dressing room. And 99% of the time, those kids were being picked on and bullied on something that wasn't even true. But here's something that actually is true. And if people find out, my life is over. And so I hid that from everybody for a long, long time. And I carried that with me like nobody knew, not my family, nobody. And I was always trying to cover that up, cover up how I was feeling inside. And hockey was what I did for all those years prior to that, that helped me feel better. Hockey was my first drug, and then alcohol. And I had a hard time putting alcohol down. I was kind of quickly became the guy that always wanted to drink because I wanted to escape from myself. But no drugs. Drugs were never going to be a part of my story until that music festival, when I broke and went against everything that I stood for. And the one time turned into two, three, four, 10, 50, 100 times, where it felt like pretty soon I couldn't control myself, because while I was taking those drugs, it made me feel better. And of course, when it was over, you feel 100 times worse than you did before you started. But that cycle of wanting to pick up and use and drink and feel better
Well, yeah, I
became
read something about like it's
endless.
called the addict's fantasy, where you think you want to control and enjoy your drug of choice, but you in reality you can never do it. Reality you can't do either, because there's pain to mask and medicate, right? So we're trying to do you're seeking this high, but you're just trying to
Yeah.
mask the other.
Yeah, and like from there, like pretty quickly from there, like it's really started to affect my life, both on and off the ice. My mental health really started to deteriorate even quicker when those substances were kind of introduced, and I was using them quite frequently. Um, and there was times along the way where I had people recognize that something was going on, but having the mentality of a hockey player, and I don't even know if it's just hockey players or athletes. I think generally speaking, people feel like nobody's going to understand, or if people find out, they're going to judge me harshly, and it's going to affect X, Y, or Z. In this
Of
case,
course.
for me, it was my hockey career. And at 17, 18 years old, I wasn't confident to walk into a coach's office and be like, hey, I'm struggling with my mental health. I'm struggling with self-medication and drugs and alcohol, and I can't stop it. That was never an option for me, at least at that time, even
Did you
when I
ever
had
hear
coach.
from those? I'm curious if you ever heard from those players, if your story has gone out there. Did anyone ever reach out to you and apologize for and maybe encouraging you, or maybe they've kept quiet? No, I'm not trying to out anyone. I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
Yeah.
Did you, because I feel like those conversations, are they part of recovery, stuff that you maybe might hang on to, or did you ever like, hey, had you never offered that to me, maybe I wouldn't have been here where I am today, or um
Yeah.
obviously, you have
Like
to own your choices, I understand that. I'm just
yeah.
curious if that ever came across
Yeah.
your mind.
Not in that particular case, but I've had people reach out to me and say different things, apologize, or say I wish I could have known and been there for you more, and things like that. There's also been some people that I thought would have reached out by now that haven't, and that's been early on. I think that was hard, but I've just accepted that people come and go from your life, and things happen the way they happen, and we just have to accept it and move on. The other piece to that, Janine, is that I've actually been the one to pick up the phone and apologize to some people myself, and probably still have some people that I need to do that to, now that it's coming back up. And I'm always trying to have a list of people to make amends to. As you can imagine,
Yeah.
it's a very long list. But I've been on the other side of that, of peer pressuring other people, hockey players and others, to drink and to try something. And unfortunately, I have some friends that are still struggling, that have passed away. That's kind of how it started, whether it was me directly or not. When you're living that life, especially young, and it's like a party scene, you never imagine that it's going to end in the worst possible way. The worst possible way being a death by overdose or suicide, or years and years of struggle, being in jail, homeless. Like, that's never in the realm of possibilities when you're first starting and it's fun and everyone's doing it and you feel kind of invincible. But let me tell you that our choices, one choice can really set you on a path for destruction. And I think that's something that we need to have conversations around and help people, especially youth, understand that their choices really matter. One choice can affect their life, but also those that are around them as well. And it's where we come into like leadership. You talk about peer pressure, and when I talk to students and athletes and organizations, when I go do my talks, especially with the students, I always tell them, like, your real friends will not peer pressure you, right?
Mhm.
And that that's facts. And I think there's a big gap in young minds understanding that, but I think we can close and start to bridge that gap and start to nurture and really bring upon leaders in communities, whether it's hockey dressing rooms or schools or wherever, that start to feel confident enough to speak up of when they see something that's not right, like a kid being peer pressured or bullied or any number of things. I think we need to start building people up, because we can't get to everybody, and there's always going to be those around that are going to be trying to encourage negativity, whether it be drinking, drugs, or whatever, because misery loves company. I can certainly relate to that. Like I just said, I was that guy at different times in my life. But if we can start to just build people up, to speak up in those situations when they see something that's not right, then I truly believe that we can make a big impact. And the fact is this, is that these conversations are not being had enough, not in schools or anywhere. And there's a lot of pushback when it comes to
There'd be a
education
class.
surrounding.
Like we need a financial class, and we need a
Yeah,
drugs and alcohol class. We need,
yeah. But
as
don't
a
worry, Janine. Don't worry. They're gonna teach you how to graph a circle, right? Like, I don't know. I often wonder about the school system, and is it really setting up everybody for the best path to success? And every single time when I talk about this, the answer is no. It's simply
I mean,
no.
there's a place
There's
for education. You want to be educated, but a lot of times I've heard university is basically to see if you can follow in line. 4 years, do what you say you're going to do. Da da da. I mean, unless you're being a doctor, I really don't want to poo poo on like education. We need,
no, no, no,
and I
no.
know that's not what you're saying, but there is a lot that is taught where you're like, I hear what you're saying. I
Yeah,
want
I
to go
just
back to you. uh I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right. You built a studio. So is this when when you decided like enough's enough, I'm gonna turn my life around? Was it after that skating on that outdoor pond? Was that kind of when you said you didn't feel well? Was that the inciting moment where you're like, holy shit, I used to feel like this and now I feel like this? Was that
uh
what was the turnaround moment for you to start changing things around in 2020?
yeah, yeah, turnaround moment for me was like, people know my story, they've heard my story, but there's very, very few people, if anybody in this world, that really knows all the details and understands how dark it was, how different I was in my time of addiction. Um, I was not a very good person. Like, I really wasn't. I was hopeless and on a path of destruction. And when I got to a certain point, I stopped caring about myself and my choices and what I did or who was around me. I was literally a menace to society for many, many years. And on this one particular night, I was going to go do something that we'll just say is not great. And I left to go do this act, if you will, this criminal act. And somewhere along the way that night, while I was going, well, I had to walk because I didn't have a car. Like I was really hard up, let's just say. And while I was walking, I literally heard this voice. It was like this crystal clear night up here in Muskoka, and I was walking, and there were stars, and it was on the 141 highway, and it's like very few street lights, and I was walking, and all of a sudden I heard this voice was like, you're really gonna go do that right now? Like, who the hell are you? Because at this point, I was about 2 or 3 weeks. I hate to use the word clean because it's insinuating that people are dirty if they're on drugs, and I just don't like that. So, but 2 or 3 weeks where I just had put the drugs down, and I really had made a decision that I was going to stop because I was about to be a dad again, and that was a big push. But I was still very skewed in my brain with my thinking. And when you've lived the life that I lived for those years, that was a hard piece to break, was just that the person I had become, I felt like it was so ingrained in me, the criminal side and the drug side. And it sounds very convoluted because it is. And to understand it, you're gonna have to read my book when it comes out next year, probably. But I went walking this night, and like I said, I heard this voice, and somewhere in there it said, like, if you just turn around and go home, your life will become better than you could have ever imagined. There,
Mm.
that was pretty much it. That was pretty much it. And there's been many times in my life, and I don't know if anybody else can relate to this, that our intuition, and if you just listen and put your phone down and get in tune with yourself, that we actually know the path for ourselves quite a bit more than you'd ever believe if you just listen and pay attention to the world around you and what's going on between your head. Because there's moments of clarity that come, and this was a moment of clarity. And so I went home, and then the next day is when I put my skates back on. And so I put my skates back on, and then I had this other kind of vision where I felt like my story and all that I'd been through could help just one person. It was never about creating a social media and having thousands of followers or anything. Like I had no idea what that entailed at the time. I didn't even have social media. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any idea, but I just had a feeling that my story could help one person. And I held on to that. And I still hold on to that to this day, where it's not a daunting task to help one person. We
No.
can all help one person every single day. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can just be a random small act of kindness. But I really felt like my story could help people. And so I got the idea to start my podcast, and the rest was kind of history. And I think what you're alluding to was hearing the story of Matthew Lazinski, who is a former OHL
Mhm.
player, and he was really the first hockey player that I heard of that passed away by fentanyl overdose. And fentanyl is my drug of choice for almost 10 years. So, and had many overdoses myself. And so it was the first time that I realized that maybe I wasn't the only hockey player who really struggled. And it kicked my butt, and started to really push me in the direction that I'm in now. And shortly thereafter, I found out that a former teammate of mine, a guy that I was roommates with in the American Hockey League, had the same fate. Mitch Fadden also passed away of a fentanyl overdose. And from there, I just started to uncover one story after another. And, as we're having this chat, I'm aware of 106 hockey players, and those are just the ones that I know of. 106 hockey players that have passed away by suicide or overdose. And, I just made a decision that I wanted to share and honor those stories, and bring this conversation to the table, because so many of them passed away and we never heard about it because they didn't make it to the NHL. They weren't a celebrity status,
Mm.
but they lived their whole lives trying to get there. And when it didn't happen for any number of reasons, they found themselves in a life of struggle. And sadly, they're no longer here to tell their stories. And so that was something that gave me the initial push. And every single day I check in with myself and remind myself why I'm doing this, and just how lucky I am to be able to share my story and to just wake up every morning and take a breath. Because there was a time, Janine, not too long ago, just a few short years ago, where I would wake up and my eyes would open and be like mad that I'm alive, like every day, just hoping that today is going to be the day that my misery ends, because that's where the place where I was in. Like
I
people
know
live.
I read that there were some times where you like how many times you basically have cheated death basically in with your choices. So I mean, I do believe that we all have that. There's a path for all of us, and you were meant to go through that darkness to bring you to where you are today. Like I read, you have the clothes. Is it mental health over hockey, or is that on the t-shirts, or is that a conversation?
Yeah. So that there is a t-shirt that and sweatshirts that say mental health over hockey. That's part of the, if we have a few minutes, I can tell you the story. It's a pretty cool story, especially for people, I think, in Ontario.
Yeah, go for it.
So back in, it would have been, I guess, like 3 years ago, almost to the day, I well, I had this idea to like help support hockey players. I really wanted, after hearing all those stories and Mitch and Matthew and all the rest of the tragic stories that I heard where they were no longer here. I really wanted to do something to honor them, but also to help other hockey players who were struggling. And I wanted to start a nonprofit or a charitable organization to help do that. And boy, let me tell you, it was a daunting task. It still is. I was calling lawyers, and like I said, I was on welfare. I didn't even have $10 in the bank. I don't even think I had a bank account at the time. And it just was getting
Where
very
there's a will,
overwhelming.
there's a way.
That's right. But Doug Gilmore's older brother, Dave, who the Gilmore family, aside from Doug, they're all retired prison guards, right? And at this time, I was only out of jail for like 6 months. And Dave Gilmore and Doug, and because of my podcast, Doug had been on it a couple times, and I had a lot of people kind of like supporting me and encouraging me and stepping up when I needed them to. And Dave actually wanted to raise some money to help the cause. He knew my idea, but knew I was kind of treading water. And on his 70th birthday, he wanted to do a fundraiser, and he did. This was 3 years ago, where he ran 20 kilometers and biked 50 kilometers. On his 70th birthday, he traveled 70 kilometers with his son up in Kingston, and they raised somewhere around the $3,500 mark,
Wow.
isn't a ton of money, but it's a lot of money at the same time. But it wasn't enough to pay the lawyers and to do all the things. But it was the first time that somebody really kind of trusted me. Like, here I
Hmm.
went from $5 to $3,500 in I think I had to get it sent to somebody else's bank account because I didn't have one. But it was a big moment. And
Yeah.
there
Showed you
it
what's
was
possible, right?
pretty early on in my recovery, and it could have been a moment where I took that money and went back to my old ways or whatever, but I didn't. It was it was tough because I really just wanted to create a foundation to help support hockey players, and it felt like it was a long ways away still. I didn't know what to do with this money because it wasn't enough to do what I wanted to do, and I just felt like it was never going to get anywhere. So I figured, how can I carry the message while I'm trying to figure out how to do this? And that was, okay, well, maybe I'll try to start a clothing line. And I had no idea how to do that. I still have very little idea how to do it.
Just wear it
But I,
around and then people want to
yeah,
buy it.
but I bought a heat press and a vinyl cutter and self-taught how to press shirts and design logos and websites and the whole thing. Like, I did it all on my own for a long time. Still pretty much it's just me and my business partner Susan, who's Harry Sinden's niece, who's the coach of the 72 Summit Series. She's in her early 70s, and she's the only other help with the clothing line still to this day. Um, but yeah, it's gone very well. The clothing line I'm wearing, one of the hoodies now. But what we do as part of it is we put a name of one of those hockey players,
Aw.
one of the 106 hockey players in all of our stuff. So right there's Daniel Miner. He played for the Barrie Colts of the OHL in 2021. He sadly passed away of a fentanyl overdose. And so it's a way to honor and remember them. And like a lot of the family members, they
I
wear it,
love
and it's
that.
really
Yeah.
cool. And there's people all over the world now, Australia, Europe, Canada, the United States, Mexico, wearing puck support. And
Excuse me.
it's for me, it was about trying to create really powerful conversations. It wasn't
Hmm.
about finding answers or solutions. It was about walking into an ice rink with a shirt that says it's okay to be not okay, or mental health over hockey, or puck
Yeah.
addiction, right? Like just different things that I created. And I get messages. I mean, I get a lot of messages these days, but I love the ones that where someone will say, "Hey, I was wearing my puck support hoodie last night, and instead of complaining to this other guy about our kid's ice time, I actually found out that he's bipolar and his kid's ADD and his
Uh,
older son struggles with addiction." And so when you can help create these conversations when I'm not there, and it's just a shirt that is starting those conversations to break down the barrier to for people to be vulnerable and to support one another. I mean, that to me is the best part about all of it. And it's
yeah.
been extremely, extremely powerful. And yeah, so that was something that I started 3 years ago. And now we have stores that are wanting to carry it. And it's a very daunting task trying to figure out the business end of it because I have very little know-how. But I'm quite confident that in the next year we'll
You'll
be
figure it
we'll
out.
we'll be a nationally, at least here in Canada, we'll be in quite a few different stores. And
I
um,
believe it.
yeah,
What
so
I
it's
curious
cool.
before we, because your parents, well, obviously this is your own journey, but I often, you always you hear the story, but how did this affect your loved ones? I mean, I'm sure I can only imagine, but what was that journey like for you? And where are things now? Are you good with your family after everything you've been through? One thing that I actually kind of got teary-eyed because I'm highly emotional and I'm a very empathetic, compassionate person, but I read about how your father was a retired firefighter and he paid for rehab and drug debts, but he gave up on you when you went to prison. But when you came out, he bought you your microphone. And that to me was like, oh God, parents' love is never goes away. But what did that moment mean to you in the grand scheme of everything you've been through? And then I feel like that would just kind of, I don't know, it makes me emotional just asking it.
Yeah, me and my dad have been through a lot over the years. He was my coach through minor hockey, and I was a troubled kid, Janine. Put my dad in some really, really tough spots as a kid. I was angry and a problem child, if you will. And I think there's reasons now that we reflect back and people have a greater understanding, but all through it, for the fact that I wasn't willing to talk about it even from an early age and to accept help and to let people in, it came out in different ways. And a big part of that was people creating their own narrative and ideas about who I was and why I was doing or acting the way I was or whatever. And so like my dad, he tried to help. He, like you said, he paid for multiple rehabs and drug debts, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And my dad does not have a lot of money by any means. I mean, retired fireman, scouts in the Western Hockey League, but like it's not a lot of money.
Mm,
He spent a lot of money trying to help me and get me out of trouble. And I can reflect back on those times, and I took advantage of it because I was so addicted that when you're going through that, you don't want to hurt anybody, but all that matters is it's a very selfish disease where, especially opiates, when you're literally screaming, your body's screaming in pain for more, it feels like you're going to die. Nothing else really matters,
yeah.
right? You get what you need, whatever you have to do. And so there's a lot of things that I did. And first I hurt my family, but when they couldn't take anymore, then you start to filter out and take it out on others. And that's where like crime starts and why I went and ended up in jail and all the different things, right? But it was really disappointing, I think, for my dad being sentenced to jail, front page news in the Vancouver Sun and Vancouver Province, like right on the cover, like former hockey pro sentenced to jail for like robbing a taxi at knife point. And like they had the story kind of wrong, but still, regardless, it didn't look good. And my dad, he didn't come see me in jail for a year. I mean,
Mm,
I spent 3 years in jail. It wasn't just like a week. I was in there for 3 years, 2 years once, and then a year out here in Ontario. And my dad, yeah, he didn't want to come see me. And he didn't want to talk to me. And I remember I got out of jail just before I started my podcast. And he kind of saw that I skated, like we talked about going on the lake, and because I had Facebook at the time, and he was on my Facebook, and I mean, he was terrified. I think it was just a matter of time until everything
Mm.
fell apart and it was so new. I remember I called him and I said, Dad, like, this is one of the first times I talked to him. He picked up the phone. I'm like, I'm going to start a podcast. Go back, sorry, Janine. I don't think I've ever told anybody this. Maybe on my podcast when my dad came on, but there was multiple times while I was in jail where I wrote my dad a letter, like a handwritten letter, where in that letter a couple different times I would say like I apologize for like literally destroying our family's last name, like not just him but his deceased father and everything, like pretty well respected name where we come from, and I just trashed it, and I started to feel really guilty about it. But I tell him in these letters that one day somehow I'm gonna make you proud again. Like I'm gonna do it. I don't know how. I have no idea how, Dad, but I'm gonna make you proud again. I'm gonna restore our last name, like, especially in hockey. And
Yeah.
I didn't know how I was gonna do it. And I called him and I said I was gonna start a podcast, and he's like, oh, I don't know. Like I think he was very worried, right? Because like it's just like another thing to be
Yeah.
disappointed about if it doesn't work out. And I get it. He actually told me, he's like, maybe you should just like write a book and then do a podcast, which is another time in my
Let's
life
start
where
somewhere else.
I I didn't listen to my dad, as I very rarely did. And for one time in my life it actually paid off. And you're right, I didn't even own a computer, Janine. I had to borrow a computer for the longest time, and I was doing them out of a borrowed car. I was sitting in a car doing
I know,
these
I
first
read that
early
about like a
podcasts and
studio. You turned it like a 6x10 studio, and then at
chicken coop.
times you were in someone's truck, a girlfriend's mother's car in the front seat because the house was too chaotic or something. I'm like, that's a soul on a mission right there. I mean, if that doesn't
Yeah,
scream you have a purpose greater than yourself, I mean, I don't know what does. And it
I
probably
think
saved you. It like pulled the vision, pulled you forward, right?
100%. Without the podcast and without, yeah, I think that early initial support. My dad bought me a microphone, but a retired pro hockey player, he's always told me not to use his name, just because he didn't want anybody else asking him for anything. But he actually, and me and him weren't close. We worked together like at some hockey schools when I was younger. He was quite a bit older than me, but I worked hockey schools when I was in junior, like
Yeah.
16, and he was in his mid 20s or whatever. I somehow had me on Facebook. And what happened is my dad actually sent me his old computer so I didn't have to borrow a computer, but then that old computer crashed.
Oh no.
So I
Also,
made a
it got
post
you a
saying,
computer.
this guy, yeah, the retired pro hockey player, he sent me two grand so I could buy a MacBook. And I
Oh.
still have that computer, and I've done everything on that computer. And yeah, and so I mean there's a lot of people that
This
lifted me up.
conversation is big, and it's bigger. Like even when I say life after sports, I get someone that says you need to talk to the so and so, or they tell me a story about themselves. But like I think what you're touching on is a darker side that a lot of people experience but are afraid to make it known, and that's why your work is so important in the world. And I'm so grateful that we have you here today to be able to keep sharing that message. I mean, what I mean, I know we've been on here for quite a bit, but it's
I'm
such an
good. I
important
got nothing. I
topic.
got nothing going on.
Yeah.
So
Well, for parents that are struggling with a child that is acting out, or you hear stories of they got to hit rock bottom, or you can't always save them because then it doesn't. What in your experience, and I know every case is different and trauma is different for everyone. Is it just love them, support, and don't bail them out? Is it like what advice would you have for parents?
that's such a hard one. There's such a fine line between supporting and enabling. Like there's a
Exactly.
very, very, very fine line. And most parents enable, and in
Mm.
unhealthy ways. That's certainly what my dad did for many, many years, where I would just keep asking him for money, 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 every story in the book, and he knows I'm lying, but I'm not telling him the truth. And I would sometimes, like, we don't need to talk about me. You asked me a question about what do I advice do I give. Number one is parents, don't be naive. Don't think that
It can't
your
happen
kid
to them.
is, it can't happen to them, because there are a lot of people who go through it that like I said earlier, I don't think anybody ever expects that that's going to be their life. Parents never think it's going to be their kids. So number one, I think we need to be proactive. I think that's the big piece, because we always wait till a crisis, right? What do we do in a
Yeah.
crisis situation? And I'm going to get to that. And again, I don't have all the answers. That's a big piece. Crisis intervention, how to support somebody when they're struggling, like that's a big piece. But what if we could actually mitigate a lot of those circumstances by being proactive? And that's having the tough conversations with your kids and being open to people like myself and others who are willing to share their real life experience, because there's a lot of value in that.
Mhm.
And when we hear real life experiences, like I always get pushback because I'm not a doctor or a therapist or a counselor. And
Oh,
I've had
I
people
do
be like,
too. I had to
give
change.
some,
I can't say mental fitness because I'm not a psychologist, so I have to say mindset. But I've had to overcome a lot myself, and it's like I
right.
can
And,
speak from
and
my
it's,
experiences. We're allowed to do
which
that,
are
right?
way more valuable than somebody who read it in a textbook. I always say, would you want somebody to build your house that just like, if you really want how to, like, if you were going to build a house and you were going to put all your money, like you wanted this house and you save this money and you're going to build a house, would you want somebody that's actually been there
Yeah,
before and built the
exactly.
house? Or do you want somebody that went to school and read it in a book and maybe can piece it together because of what
Yeah,
they see and
no,
what they've heard? No, no, no. You want the people
yeah,
that have had their hands in it, the lived experience. And this is no different. Now, a combination of the two could be
is
great,
of
right?
course, yeah, yep.
But yeah, and so you asked me about parents, about enabling, and I'll just speak on my experience. And again, I don't have the answers. I will tell you what worked for me, and it was the hardest thing that I had to go through. My dad cut me off. No more. Zero. Don't call me, don't whatever, and unless you want help, or unless it's something that, like, don't call me for money, don't call me because you're in trouble, don't,
Yeah,
none of the things. I mean, I was in my 30s now, late 20s, early 30s. I'm not a little boy. And a lot of parents get caught in that because they're like, they don't want to kick their kids out, because where will they go? Well, you know what? I ended up homeless for like a year. I ended up in jail. I almost died in the process. But let me tell you, what I was doing to my dad, the mental toll that it took on my dad while I was calling him with all these outlandish stories and money and, oh, this person's going to kill me and all the different things or whatever. Like my dad needed to, for his own mental health,
mm,
cut me off, because
yeah,
he couldn't go anywhere or do anything. He was just in a constant, literally, I had him so stressed out that he was in the hospital having a minor heart attack and telling me like, Brady, I have no more money for you. I have no more. I'm in the hospital, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but can you just send me like another
yeah,
$500? And he literally sent me a picture of him on a gurney in the hospital. And I was so addicted. I still remember it's one of my lowest moments where it was like, yeah, okay, but can you still please give me money? And like after that, my dad was like, you know what? Like, done, because that's what you have to do. So my advice is this: if you have someone in your life with it, let's talk addiction, who's really struggling with addiction, there is nothing you can do that is going to pull that person out of addiction. They are going to have to find it on their own. You can help them by getting them to rehab if you want to pay for a rehab, sure, whatever. But at the end of the day, when I was forced to put my big boy pants on and start to navigate, like no one's paying for my rehab, no one's gonna give me money, no one's, and yeah, it was
yeah,
really, really hard. It was really, really hard. I almost didn't make it through it. But maybe the next time my dad sent me money was going to be the time that I got drugs and it killed me, right? Like it's enabling and supporting are two
they're
different
blurry.
things,
They're
but
blurry
they're
too.
blurry.
Yeah,
Yes, they're
for
very,
sure.
very blurry. And my heart goes out to any person who deeply cares and loves somebody who is struggling with addiction, because it's an animal. It's the devil. I swear it is so evil. People are not themselves when they're in addiction. They're not they're not. I always say I was on the bus, but I was not driving. I was just on the bus
Yeah,
for a
going through
ride,
the
and I had
motions.
no going through the motions, I had no control. But you have to just kind of let them go. That's my
Yeah.
advice. And I tell people this all the time. I get this question all the time. And they ask my advice and I give it to them and they don't like the answer. And they keep
Mhm.
doing the same things that they're going to do. And I get it. I'm a parent. I have young kids. I couldn't imagine what it would be like. I couldn't imagine turning my back on my kid when they're struggling. But at some point, like when you got to the point where I'm at, there was nothing nobody was going to do or say outside of myself that was going to help me, right? I had to
For
find it
sure.
on my own. And I found that it's actually, for me, again, this is my experience. My parents and those closest to me were the last people that I wanted to get honest with because those are the last people that I wanted to disappoint, right?
Of
I
course.
didn't want them to know. And in the end, I mean, I ended up
They knew the
disappointing
whole
them
time.
even more. Exactly, right? But when you're in it,
Yeah.
that's what you're thinking.
Yeah.
It was actually people outside of that circle, my inner circle, that were able to help support me more, that were more relatable, that had this lived experience, that had
Yeah.
been through it, that had gone through it. So parents, like you have to get out of your own way sometimes, and unfortunately, it's very, very difficult, but there's nothing that you're going to do or say today that's going to all of a sudden snap your loved one out of addiction or crisis. It's just not. And it's a very, very long road. And I'm sitting here, I look over my fridge. I've lost so many friends to overdose, Janine. It's not even funny. Like I've met over 1,000 people in my life that have died by overdose, just within the life that I live, being homeless, in jail, all the different places, because there's a lot of addiction in those places, obviously. But I'm looking at like one of my best friends from childhood, a guy we used heroin together for the first time. He was clean for 2 years, had one moment of relapse, and he died of an overdose. And
Mm.
so it's a very long process. And just because somebody gets a day, a month, a year, almost 4 years for me, the reality is that it can change at any given moment. I will say this though, that when somebody is legitimately trying, it's vital that you stand by them. It's
Yeah.
and that's something that you have to learn to decipher is when is
When
the
you're getting the
person
real
act.
person versus when you're getting
Yes,
the, yeah, that makes
yes,
sense.
and be very vigilant because addicts will tell you things, anything that they know you want to hear, anything they have to say or do anything they have to do to get what they want. But they always want something. There's a reason why they want to take, they want to take, they want to take, they want to take. And to get to the point where they're actually open to getting help and to start mending their life, those glimpses are few and far between. And so it's very important. And again, you won't always see them, but it's very important to understand to the best of your ability when those happen. Because if somebody wants help today, they might not want help tomorrow.
Yeah.
And something could happen today that completely spins them off that path of wanting help. And so I think when somebody wants the help and they're serious about it, then find ways to rally around them and support them. But if they're just caught in the same cycle of addiction, don't give them money, don't give them, don't enable them to stay on that path. Pull yourself away as hard as it's going to be. And unfortunately, sometimes it may end in the worst ways, but keeping them there and giving them money and fueling their addiction or whatever is not helping them either.
No,
So
for
it's
sure.
it's it's really hard. And there's a lot of people that are close to me in my life that are going through this, like really close to me. I have some people that are really close to me that don't want to hear this, that I tell them this all the time, like family, friends who have, I've almost like a brother type guy, not my blood brother, but essentially a brother who's really in it. And mom is just continually, enabling out of thinking that that's what love is. How can I turn my back on my child? But you're just keeping that individual in that cycle of addiction, and it only ends in one of two ways, and it's you're either eventually going to die or you're going to get better. Those are the facts. I remember, Janine, this is kind of a little bit off topic, but just for anybody listening, right? The very first time I went to a meeting, I was in rehab, but I went to an outside meeting, AA, I think it was. No, it was NA, because NA's mantra is this, Narcotics Anonymous, where it was like jails, institutions, or death. Like that's where addiction takes us. Jails, institutions, or death. And I remember the first time I heard that, I had never overdosed. I had never been to jail. And it was my first time in rehab, which is technically an institution. I'd never been to a psych ward yet either, because I spent a lot of time in there. Been a lot of different places, Janine. But I remember hearing
Lots of
that.
life experience. That book's gonna be good.
I remember hearing that and being like, yeah, not me. Like, yeah, I'm addicted. Yeah, I'm pretty bad, but like jail, nah, I could never end up there. This is where it takes you. It might not
Mm,
happen in a day, a week, a year, but eventually it's jails, institutions, or death. And that's just the reality. And addiction is very, very hard. And I'm glad that we've been able to talk about it a little bit or more so on this podcast, because mental health, those is at the utmost of importance. And again, it's very important for everyone to understand that people are addicted because they're struggling with their mental health. That's why every single time, every single person that's addicted, alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, whatever the addiction is, every single person has an underlying mental health circumstance and or mental illness every single time. So addiction falls under that mental health umbrella for me. Like there's no questions. But you talk about mental health. It's marketable now, right? Mental health is almost like it's sadly marketable in this
yeah.
world. It's a buzzword, right? Campaigns, mental health, it's important, yes. But what about addiction? What about substance abuse? Let me tell you that there is a very, very dark cloud over addiction. Schools, they don't really want to have people come in and talk about it. Parents don't really want to talk about it with their kids. They don't want to be open with their kids. I mean, how many parents listening to this right now have had their own experiences with drugs, but don't want to share that with their own kids,
Mm-hmm.
right? How many, right? I think those conversations are really important. And I think we just need to have these spaces where people can share open and honestly and educate and just be open to allowing topics like this to come up in your household, in your schools, if you're a coach, in your dressing room. Like if you're a real leader, which I look to principals and teachers and coaches as leaders, and there's many others, bosses, owners of companies, leaders. I truly believe that it's your duty to start to bring like somebody has to be the one to be like, you know what? Enough's enough.
Yeah.
We're actually gonna bring this in, and this is now part of our teaching, whatever it may be, curriculum for schools, whatever. But leaders, you have to get over the fact that talking about it does not create more of it, right?
Yeah.
We don't talk about it because we don't want
The
to
word
happen. I'm
they're
not
going to
going to talk
expose them to it, and then it's going to plant the seed, and then it's going to turn into, yeah. But education
exactly
is power for sure. And then
100%.
it's not as shocking when they're exposed. It's like they've already anticipated it, right? It's like, oh, I already knew this was
Right.
coming, thing, and they're more equipped. No, I know you touch on so many important topics, and I feel like this conversation could go on forever because there's just so many layers to it. And I'm
Well,
so grateful.
I'm happy to hop on again if you ever want to do a part two. I'm not sure. Like the thing is I host a podcast, Hockey to Hell and Back as well. And early on, I had all these questions laid out, and this is how the conversation's going to go. And I'd have
No,
all
it
these
never goes.
pages. I'd have pages of notes, and at the end of it, I'm like, why did I spend three
No.
hours prepping for the show when I didn't ask a single one of these questions? So I'm sorry if it didn't go the way
No,
that maybe
no,
was hoped or
no, I
anything, but
love it. No, I don't plan. I like to know background just so that I know the story, but no, I think you gave more and then some. So, I love it. I mean, for again, these conversations are to help those struggling in silence and suffering around the world. I want you to know that you're not alone. There are even it doesn't, I talk to NCAA or high school athletes. You don't have to be a pro to have this type of issue.
yeah.
And not even issue. We all have mental health issues to some degree. I mean,
Yes, we
no,
do.
nobody's perfect, but just creating that space to know that you're not alone. And if you can do it, Brady, after everything you've been through, it's like if you can see him, you can be him. So can I, for people. And I
Yeah.
always bring girls to see, like, if you can see her, you can be her, and they can see if I can overcome this, so can you. So, it's been such a pleasure, guys. This is episode 40. We've got Brady Leavold. He's the founder of the Puck Support Network, the Puck Support Corporation, and I love Believe Hockey, but the way you spell it, I still first time I saw it, I love that. But I watch your stuff every day. I'm entertained, I'm educated, I'm inspired. Don't stop. Even if anybody makes any comment like the social trolls do on the world,
Oh
don't
yeah.
stop. And your mission in life is very clear, and I'm cheering you on all the way. So thank you for contributing to this very important conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. I just want to echo those words too of if you're out there, you're not alone. Regardless of what you're going through, there are people in this world that understand, that care, and maybe it's not the exact same story, but there's a lot of parallels in all of our stories. And I've found that once I was willing to get vulnerable, my life changed. It changed literally in a moment, and it just continues to get better. Um, just before we go, Janine, I want to say too that asking for help was the biggest thing for me. For me to get my life back, it was putting on my skates. But through that, I forgot to mention that once I put my skates back on and I felt like my story could help people, I knew that if my story was going to help people, it needed to come from a place of honesty and vulnerability. And so I was able to reach out and talk about that childhood trauma. Now I share bits of it when I talk in front of large audiences or on my podcast. It's still hard to do it, but it was absolutely necessary for me to at least tell one person and stop carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. And
Yeah.
when I did that the first time, holy cow, like it people always say, it feels like 1,000,000 pounds was lifted off your back. I had never had that feeling before. I always felt like the world was pushing against me. And when I was able to share that, let me tell you, I had that feeling myself where it was like, this is what people are talking about, I now I
Yeah.
get it. So
It's so
just know
true.
that just know that you're not alone, and there's a way out. There is a way to healing. There's no perfect way. The last thing I'm going to say is that I still struggle, right? I have multiple mental health diagnoses, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. And when I open my eyes in the morning, though I'm grateful to be alive, I sometimes don't know which version of Brady is gonna show up. And there's we didn't get into it, but there's things in that I'm learning every day, and that I try to implement to the best of my ability every day to help keep me on track. But there is no perfection. And I've been able to stay clear of drugs and that for almost 4 years, but there's days where the darkness is still real. And sometimes I need to do a better job taking my own advice of reaching out and asking for help. But I certainly know what it feels like to just want to have, feels like you have to do it on your own. And I just want to reiterate that you never have to. And though it can be scary and kind of daunting, it'll be the best decision that you ever made is to ask for help. And if it doesn't work the first time,
Ask again.
don't yeah, don't give up, right?
Mhm.
And you might have to find multiple different support networks or people or different things that work. It's just like anything, you have to try it. Does this work for me? No, but don't get discouraged. There's other ways of
Keep
dealing
showing
with it.
up. Keep showing
I
up.
love that. I love that. Okay. And now I'm gonna shut up. I
No,
appreciate you having me on.
it's okay.
Thank you for
No,
the time.
it's such great information. I love it. And if it helps someone else, like you say, if one person gets what they need from this, we've done our job. So we're on the same page there. So everybody, episode 40, Brady Leavold, thank you so much.